Hello and welcome to the StopDevaluation podcast. I'm your host and founder of the StopDevaluation movement, Melodye Hilton. The heart of this movement is to see the value in all of humanity and live courageous lifestyles of using our power for good instead of harm. We can affect change by choosing validation over judgment, and I hope you'll take your place and make a positive impact in this world. Gaining knowledge and the wisdom to apply that knowledge empowers us to compassionately be a voice of validation to those hurting from racial prejudice. If you desire to understand a race or a culture, then it is so important to know the historical facts which support a collaborative voice of healing to our world. Lewis Dickens reveals the painful Black history and solutions for healing. If you are a white person and genuinely care, you must hear this interview. Lewis and I have partnered together and modeled diversity and inclusion on a deep heart level for almost 20 years. This is an interview you do not want to miss. Welcome, everyone, to the Culture of Validation interview with Lewis Dickens. Lewis, I am so excited to have you a part of the StopDevaluation movement today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I have known you for years, and we've partnered together in so many ways, a baby boomer, and I believe you're a Gen Xer, or are you a millennial? I'm not sure.
Generation X, yes.
You know, black and white, young, old, whatever it is. But both of us carry a strong heart and passion to confront prejudice and injustice in our world. And you are a Black American living in Ghana, West Africa, and you have traveled the globe. You've celebrated different cultures, races, ethnicities. And what have you learned about prejudice, bias, assumption, and stereotypes?
You know, what I've learned, and I will just apply it to my own life. I'll just give my own experience rather, is that prejudice at times comes from ignorance, which is lack of knowledge.
Yes.
And what I've learned is when I went to another country and had to learn another culture and adapt in another cultural setting, the more information, the more knowledge I got on the culture, the more history, just the more facts, it helped to give me a knowledge that balanced me out and balanced, my opinions and my thoughts and, even my responses. Sometimes it's like we can build ourselves up in knowledge, but there's no application of that knowledge. And I think that especially culturally, once we, have dug and we've gotten the history, we've gotten facts, we've gotten information on another culture or another cultural situation, then now there should be a responsibility for us when we engage that culture to apply the knowledge that we have. And I don't mean in an awkward way and saying things that we shouldn't. I just believe it should become a part of our mental database and a part of the way that we move and the way that we respond and the way that we navigate. So that's some of what I've learned in dealing with other cultures.
It's true, because through knowledge and wisdom, the application of that knowledge, prejudice, bias, assumptions, stereotypes, that flies out the window, because now I have understanding and I have empathy and I want to be a part of validating others.
Right.
So right now in our nation, the United States, racial tension has risen to the forefront once again after the horrific abuse of power of that police officer. Do you believe that our nation has not made any headway in confronting prejudice and racism, or do you believe it was just pushed down temporarily just to rise again?
I believe both, actually. I believe that we have made headway. There have definitely been efforts from many on, I believe, all sides of the coin to deal with racism to exploit racism. But then, secondly, I believe there's another whole aspect of it that has been pushed down, and so we're sort of, now having to deal with the elephant in the room because
Mm,
there's no more space to hide in. You know what I mean?
yeah.
We pushed him down as far as we can push him, and the elephant is not something that you can easily hide. So at some point, he's going to show up,
Yes.
and I think we're in a place right now where the elephant is showing up.
So, do you believe that prejudice is woven systemically into our culture? And if you believe that, how do we continue to pull that thread from the fabric of our nation?
I believe it's woven systemically in culture, but I believe it also is formed by individual incidents. Like something happens to me, and
Hmm.
instead of me seeing it as a general injustice, I see it as a racial injustice. I believe that things have happened like that. Whereas um, maybe someone has had a certain encounter with a white person or a black person or a Mexican, and they encountered a rude person, and instead of them, identifying this person as a rude person, they identify it. This is a rude black person, and this is who black people are, or this is a rude Mexican, and this is who Mexicans are, and this is whatever race has been come in position to do, and we use these generalizations, and
Yeah.
it forms something because we tell our wives, and then we tell our children, and then our children tell their children, and then again you have this systemic perpetuation of something that could have even been a lie in the first place. Maybe even the person that you encountered was a good person that had a bad day, but now you've judged a whole race
Yeah.
of people based upon your individual encounter. So I really believe that it's both. It goes both ways.
So, I know that you have studied a lot of history. Could you give us
Yeah.
some information that you believe would help us cross those great divides?
Yes, and I would say this, that me living. You mentioned earlier that I lived in Ghana, West Africa, and I was originally born in North Carolina, and born to African American parents, who of course came to America via slavery, and so I came to Ghana to found a human rights organization that rescues children from child trafficking and
Mm-hmm.
other forms of exploitation. But in living here, um, I learned a very valuable lesson. That at times to again understand people and understand their culture, you cannot view it through the lens of your own culture or
Mm,
yeah, and when I say your own culture, I'm talking about individually. Every family has their own culture. That's just the culture in their particular household.
mm-hmm.
But then there's a greater culture. There's a culture within your ethnicity. Maybe you're Scottish or Irish or African or Jamaican or whatever. So there are cultural, filters and cultural epithets within that. And so it's best that when you're trying to understand someone who is completely unrelated to your culture, that you research them, and you do the proper research to understand where they came from. And even there could be certain things, like there was something um, in the Ghanaian culture that I didn't understand, and it was something that would always be in commercials and always be in movies, and I had a quote unquote um, my perspective was based upon my personal culture,
Mm,
my personal religious culture, my personal culture in my home, my personal culture, my American cultural influences. And so, but as I did the research on the history of why they believe that and why this, particular subject was so strong and prevalent in media, I realized that it was not what I thought. And so, getting back to your question, I think it's really good when you really want to understand another culture to do the proper research and to understand the origins and why they believe the way that they do and why they think and why they tick the way that they tick, if that makes sense. And so some of the things like in African American culture, of course, many of us have been, are still, this is 2020, we still have roots and we have connections to the slave trade. And many people will say, well, why is that? Slavery ended, and I think it was 1863, if I could be wrong, but I think it was around 1863. And, so no actual perpetrators of slavery, the buyers or the sellers or the perpetrators of the violence or abuse or exploitation are alive. But again, as we talk about racism being systemic and something that's passed down, the effects of such atrocities, they affect you. Even psychologically, the effects, the long term effects of PTSD, the long term effects of certain abuses and sexual abuse and physical abuse and certain types of trauma, it affects your children. It affects your children's children. It affects the way that you think about things. It affects the way that you even see the world at large. And so I believe it's important that we understand that. And when you look at slavery, slavery, people were trafficked. Humans were trafficked from Africa. They were trafficked from Africa unwillingly. And when you go into African history here, I live in Ghana here, and we were one of the major ports of slavery. When you go to the slave council, what you'll find out is that the Europeans who traded slaves, they when they came to the chiefs to get people initially, I want to talk about the initial phase. Initial phase of slavery was a negotiation between chiefs concerning people, concerning human beings. And when they initially came, at that point, Africans were constantly coming back and forth, traveling from Europe and other places, and they were traveling there, and there was I think I'm saying the right term, but I think it was a sort of like an indentured servanthood. And in that particular agreement, you would work for a period of time, and then after that period of time, you would own a parcel, you would own your own land. And so you would be able to build there, you would be able to establish there. Nobody owned you. The state didn't own you. The people who brought you did not own you. After you fulfilled your work agreement, you were able to do that. So at that point in time, which I think you're talking about around 1493 or so, there was no understanding at all as to the type of slavery involved in the transatlantic slavery, where people are going into a ship and they're going to be chained down and like literal sardines. There were I even have records of whole 30 pages of just children on ships, no adults, just children on ships who were transported to the Americas without parents. So if you can imagine the trauma that would be felt for a child that, number one, being kidnapped, number two, being chained down, number three, going through physical and sexual abuse, number four, the conditions were so horrific. If you look it up, the way that they were positioned, it was so horrific. People were dying all the time. So someone could be chained to you and you would literally, they could die and be connected to you. And so, all sorts of body fluids and so many different things are taking place. This was a very scary event, not just for the children, but for the adults as well. And so imagine the long-term effects, those of you who are, study psychology, if you see, the effects of trauma for just a person who has been human trafficked, just human trafficked from one state to the next, then you see it's long-term trauma and it's long-term effects unless you really get proper therapy. But imagine these kids on this long journey to the Americas, and then you're sold and you don't have parents. You know, you're dealing with people you've never seen. You're dealing with land you've never seen, diseases you've never seen. And then you come into a place where, you know, it's brutal. You know, people wear shackles, people wear chains. If you are disobedient, you are beat with strong leather hook
Wow.
whips. If you are disobedient, you are boiled
Oh,
in front of everyone. If you are a male who has attempted to run away, excuse me for saying this, you're brutally raped in front of your children, especially your sons, because they
wow.
wanted to make a statement to the sons that if you do this, this is what will happen to you. You know, and just very demeaning, dehumanizing, demoralizing events. I mean, when
Yeah.
you're at the slave block and you're half naked, you know, and excuse me for saying, you know, men can touch women, and you know, even men would be touched or be exposed, you know, that have to have their genitals exposed because it literally is a meat market. And they're also, and that was another part of slavery when we talk about things that are systemic. When you can consider that maybe a male, an adult male, is married to whomever he's chosen to be his wife, but he doesn't have the right to be faithful to her because the in the plantation he needs to breed with the other women to keep up the production of human beings,
Wow.
because that was also a part of the business is actual breeding. So if you can imagine being a man and not even having the right to say I don't want to have sex with someone, or be a man and a woman, and there's no sanctity in marriage, you know, from a sexual standpoint, because at any time the man can be commanded to sleep with any woman on the plantation, and at any time the slave masters can have sex with the wife, with your wife, and even produce a child, and there's nothing that you can do about it.
Wow.
And so, if you can look at that emotionally, the lines that are broken down emotionally in the family, that affects you.
Yeah.
That affects you. You go generations where, you know, and because what that does is it causes you, the brain, you know, is designed to, as it were, protect us from things that are too overwhelming for emotionally for us. And so when we get in a situation where the trauma is too intense, then the brain comes in and says, okay, you know, I'm going to come in and, you know, I'm going to cause you to detach in this situation.
Yeah.
I'm going to cause you to emotionally detach so that you can survive,
Yeah.
so that you can continue to survive. Well, that emotional detachment is being passed down. Now you have a generation of another generation of a man who may not be in slavery, but there's no proper emotional attachment to the
Mm.
wife, because for generations, you know, my male ancestors could not emotionally detach because they had to have sex with so many women, and they had to be open to the master having sex with their wife and even producing children. They had to be okay with it.
Wow. My goodness. I mean, this is so horrific. And, I understand what you are saying in the fact that, I was molested from the time I was 2 years old to 9 years old, and I know how that affected my life. So when you look at this horrific injustice, this horrific abuse of power and how people were treated, and then from generation to generation, it's almost like a cellular memory. It's like woven into
That's
the
it.
DNA. And
That's
it's
it.
like sometimes I think an individual can be facing things and not even know why they're facing that or feeling
That's it.
that or responding certain ways. And it can lock people into ways of thinking and feeling, and they don't even know what the source of that is.
Yeah.
And lives are hurting and people are writhing in pain. And so, with all that you've said, I think just giving this information brings so much understanding. But what are some solutions now to impact contemporary society, to cause white races or different races to be able to understand what the African Americans have experienced, but then also the healing for the Black community?
Oh, I want to go back to a place because, sometimes when we hear things like that, we'll say, well, slavery is we're so far removed from that, and many of us, are just not even generationally in any way can sort of, you know, see ourselves connecting with that time frame. And so it makes it abstract that those things would still affect us. But then, if you look at it, when you go beyond slavery, you had, I think it's the 13th Amendment um, that allowed for African Americans after slavery, if you were, if you broke a law, that you could be put back in prison. But in that prison situation, it was literally the way that it reads, you then legally could be a slave to the state. And so they would be able to make money off of you. And so
Wow.
there's been major injustice in that realm from that point till present. Okay. And then if you look at, the Jim Crow rules,
Yeah.
it's very interesting when you look at the difference between African American slaves and Caribbean slaves. After slavery in the Caribbeans basically were able to possess the land. They were able to be to lead the government. They basically were able to take back hold of those countries. Even though they were originally from Africa, they were given this space of time to heal and to and to be able to become independent of their colonizers and their slave masters and all of that. But the interesting thing in America is that we were not given that opportunity to really heal, because after
Wow.
slavery, it was constantly reinforced that you
Wow.
are inferior. Jim Crow laws is you will you will go to the black bathroom. You will not be
Yeah.
able to eat in the restaurant. You'll eat from the back door. You'll not be able to drink from a white water fountain. You'll be able to drink from a black water fountain, and you can't walk on the same side of the road. So there is a continual mental conditioning of, for many years, that you are inferior and that you came here as a slave, and because of that, there is a subservient place that belongs to you in society. I'm coming to the question. And so then we bring it back up to even like say 60s and 70s. There were curfews in a lot of the southern cities for black people, and but in those same southern cities, I give you an example that is something that my mother told me about. That there would not be curfew for whites, and so white men could come to the black side of town, and they, excuse me for saying it like this, but they could sleep with your wife, your daughter, your auntie, your sister, whomever. And if you tried to report it, you would be killed in 24 hours. And the domestic terroristic groups like the KKK and these type of people would come and they would enforce again this inferiority, and they're enforcing it, with tyranny, because when a person was lynched in those days, they were lynched naked and they were lynched in a public place. So if you can imagine, you're coming from school and there's your father hanging naked, he's dead,
Oh
everybody
my.
can see him. Your wife is seeing you. There's no honor. And so these things continue to perpetuate a mentality that have brought us to some of the pain. And as you said, the cellular memory that many feel, and the knee jerk reaction, wherein that
Yeah.
sometimes people who have never been disconnected to a thing, because of what their ancestors went through, they immediately shift into into a gear of defensiveness and war, and every nation in history when there was injustice. There came a time where those who were being injustice rose up, and they rose up to take a stand. They could not take it anymore, and it came to a place where it's like, of course, we understand fight or flight, but they had to fight to say we can't take this anymore. So that's brought us up to where we are now. And I believe that solutions, one solution is, of course, education. I think education is so important. Education is important for any of us trying to understand each other. And I believe that education should not be just directed at we're going to just understand Black people. I think it should be directed holistically that we all need to understand each other, because also it's a fallacy to believe that every single European person or person of European descent or a white person was involved with slavery. They were not. Many people could not. Many people's ancestors were never involved in the slave trade. Many people's ancestors were actually abolitionists.
Yes.
Many people's ancestors were actually people who aided in the Underground Railroad, who funded the Underground Railroad. Martin Luther King's ministry and his social justice endeavors were funded by lots of Caucasian people, lots of white people. He had white lawyers. There were so many Europeans who, number one, helped in the abolishment of slavery, helped rescue slaves before the abolishment, and walked arm in arm with civil rights leaders who were civil rights leaders. Some even were massacred, some were hanged, some were lynched, so many different things for the cause of civil rights as well. So I think these aspects of history are very important for us all to understand. We have to understand why, at times, even Asians feel, mistreated and undercutted and all of that. But we go back and we understand that Asians were brought here. They tried to even make Asian slaves. But for whatever reason, it didn't work out for them economically. They brought Asian men to work on the railroads, and these people were mistreated, and they were not even allowed to marry who they wanted to marry. The men were only allowed to marry Black women because they were considered to be under the standard of white women. And so these are parts of American history that I think we have to understand so that we can understand each other. And then we come up with solutions and strategies so that we are not placed in bondage by the past, but we're rather empowered by the past.
Yes.
Because all of us have a past.
Yes.
And if we all trace our past, there is some sort of injustice, there's some sort of evil, it's not possible to be a human being and to not to be connected to injustice or evil or folly of some kind. And so I think in developing solutions, we have to look at it that way. And another thing I think is important for solutions is not just looking into not just history, familiarizing ourselves with history, but also familiarizing ourselves with identity. I think in this season, mentorship is very good so that we can understand culture, being put in places where we do teams and group settings, where we can troubleshoot and we can learn to appreciate our differences and, not feel like, that I'm superior because of this or, I'm inferior because of this, but see, you have a strength in this. I have a weakness in this. My strength balances out your weakness. Your strength balances out my weakness. I think a lot of these things are really important that from a very young age that we begin to promote diversity and not just suppression. I think a part of that sleeping racism is because for seasons we just suppressed it and said, listen, you don't have to be Black or you don't have to be white. Let's just get along. But the reality is I am Black and you are white and this person is Chinese and this person is Arab. And we have a background, we have a culture, we have a history, but we also have something to offer, and we need each other. Every single racial
Yes.
group, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
I in Ghana here, there was a certain we had a certain minority group in Ghana that disproportionately um, were creating a lot of injustices against the local Ghanaians, and and I begin to feel a prejudice towards that group based upon the injustices that were constantly being perpetuated. And all of a sudden, I was I think I was in Finland, and I was in this meeting, and I was in a meeting with um, a lot of people from that minority group. And as I was in that meeting, I felt a strong conviction that I needed to deal with the prejudice that was on the inside of me, because regardless of what I've seen on the news and what I've seen firsthand, every single member of that minority group cannot be guilty of that same crime.
Mm.
And so as I begin to do that, it changed my whole perspective, and not just changed my whole perspective. I got to the place to where I wanted to learn more about them, just like I wanted to learn about every other racial group that I worked with. I began to start. I even took a vacation, in a country with that synonymous with that racial group. I mean, ate foods, learned culture, so many different things. And now one of my good friends, one of my new good friends, comes from that same ethnic group, and I am mobilizing with them. I'm planning with them. We're doing so many things that's crossing cultural lines, crossing religious lines. But I just think we have to be open to new considerations,
Yes.
and we have to be open to coming out of our own cultural comfort zones so that we can understand, other people. And I think that programs and strategies to start at the very youngest ages to implement that is
Yes.
so important. I think, and the way that we have to implement it is not just, okay, we're just going to all jump into one big, melting pot of crayons, and, we'll all be mixed together. That may happen, figuratively, and that's a good thing figuratively. But I think the first thing is that we all be able to appreciate who we are individually,
Yes.
and we all be able to understand our own purpose, our own identity. Now, when I understand that, I respect what whatever God has placed in me to do, but I also respect your purpose, and I also respect your destiny as well. And now, because I respect me and I respect you, we can work together
Yes.
fully.
Yes. I am so thankful for the 20 plus years that we have partnered together. We've modeled not just diversity, but inclusion on this deep, deep heart
Yes,
level. And, you just brought me to tears again today. And I am so thankful, not just for your knowledge, but your heart and your partnership, because I am convinced that we are better together than we are separately. And when our
yes,
hearts break for the suffering of others, and we truly value the intrinsic worth of every human being, not only can they heal, but if enough of us do this, it can begin to shift the way our nation functions. It can begin to shift
yes,
even policy and legislation, not because we're legislating hearts, but because we are in a place that a culture of validation is taking place on such a deep level that we just do life differently. And it cannot be
yes.
legislated by law, even though it's good to have legislation, but it's motivated by a heart of love
That's
and
right.
validation. Thank you so
That's right.
much, Lewis. I love you from the bottom of my heart. I celebrate who you are. I celebrate how you're touching the nations of the earth and how you've impacted my life for good. I value you and love you.
I value you and love you too. Thank you so much. It was an honor to be a part.
I want to thank you for listening and encourage you to become a part of the StopDevaluation movement. Be sure to like and follow #StopDevaluation on social media, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and visit StopDevaluation.com for more information and free resources. You can help spread the movement by sharing with others, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, and most of all, by living a courageous lifestyle of using your power for good. Go out and value someone today. Your life matters, and you can make the world a better place. One word, one choice, one action of validation at a time.